Hi, I am Sherry Evans, and I am a co-founder of Operation Read and the Director of Education. And I'm with Philip Chipping, who is the founder. And today we are going to talk about the difference between a school evaluation and a private evaluation for a learning disability such as dyslexia or any disability for that matter. We'll talk about that briefly, and then we'll entertain some questions. So I'm just going to share very quickly this document that I have. This just explains a little bit about the difference between a private evaluation and a school evaluation, and we'll talk a little bit about each of these. So this is the scope of the evaluations. A private evaluation is something that you would do outside of the school. So this would be done with a neuropsychologist or a licensed psychologist, and always make sure that they are someone who is familiar with assessing and diagnosing learning disabilities. Not all of them have a lot of experience doing this, and make sure that they have done a lot of these. So I would ask that question first. They're more comprehensive. A private is more comprehensive and can include a wider range of tests, while a school evaluation is more general. It's even more specific to what they're looking for. So in a private evaluation, they will look at things like all the comorbidities that come with a learning disability, such as dyslexia, such as anxiety, depression. They will do an intelligence scale, which has some components within there that are commonly seen in a learning disability, like working memory and processing speed. They will also look at a full education assessment that will look at everything, not just reading, but they will look at math, reading, writing, spelling, comprehension, fluency, rapid automatic naming, lots of different things. They will also look at, like I said, the anxiety, depression, ADHD, and how the student is functioning all the way around. A school will often target more towards the learning disability, although they should do a fairly comprehensive examination. They usually do include an intelligence test, an education assessment, and some of those content areas, but they may select out certain subtests that will only look at those things. So it may not be as comprehensive. The purpose of the evaluations. So the private evaluation is intended to help you better understand your child overall, and a school evaluation is intended to determine if a child needs special education services. This is a really important distinction between the two evaluations. A lot of parents that have a school evaluation will come to me and say, but I don't have a diagnosis. I don't have this information. The school evaluation is only there to determine special education services and if they qualify or don't. They are not there to make a diagnosis, which is the next item. Private evaluations can provide a diagnosis, while school evaluations do not. I know in the state of Utah, the only one that can make a diagnosis is a licensed psychologist, neuropsychologist. The schools cannot make a diagnosis. So if you're looking for a specific diagnosis, a private evaluation is where you'll get that. The recommendations that come from these evaluations, private evaluations provide recommendations for a wide range of places, home. They'll give you additional resources, also suggestions for school and if special education services ought to be sought out. School evaluations will only give recommendations within the educational setting, and whether they qualify for an individual education plan or they don't, and possibly maybe some 504 accommodations that would come with that. And we talked about IEPs versus 504s in a previous video. The cost for these private evaluations can be expensive and may not be covered by insurance, while school evaluations are free. Here's the information about these. Most psychologists, neuropsychologists can bill insurance for these. The trick with this is an insurance company will not provide coverage for a specific learning disability evaluation, but they do cover things such as anxiety, depression, ADHD, other things that come with learning disabilities. And so usually a psychologist will bill under those because the comorbidity rate is so high among those that generally they will be covered by insurance because of those components. School evaluations are free, but again, they may not be as comprehensive and you may not agree with them. Another little note is if a school does an evaluation and you don't agree with the evaluation, you don't think that their results were correct or they didn't do a comprehensive enough evaluation, you can file for it's kind of a due process hearing, which is a long process, but the school can be required to pay for a private evaluation if it's proven that their school evaluation was not adequate. A little bit tough to get, but that is a process that can happen. As far as the time frame goes, schools have a set time frame for testing and results. According to the law, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, also known as IDEA, there are specific timelines that a school must do their testing and results and set up an IEP meeting if that's what the recommendations are. While private evaluations might take a long time just to get in for the evaluation if the psychologist's schedule is really backed up, and that's often what I see. So keep in mind those timeframes. Who conducts the evaluation? Private evaluations are conducted by a professional. Usually a psychologist or neuropsychologist are the ones that are qualified to do those. They're not employed by the school. They're outside of the school scope. School evaluations are conducted by school staff. Generally, there's a psychologist involved that does some of the tests that are required to have a licensed psychologist, and special education staff will often conduct the other portion of the test. You may also have an assessment done by a speech and language pathologist, possibly an occupational therapist. So those may come into play in a school evaluation. When you do a private evaluation, those would be done separately with separate professionals. Confidentiality, private evaluations are private and confidential, but school evaluation results are part of the school, the records for the child. So those are some of those differences between a private and a school evaluation. Let's talk a little bit about the process to request a special education assessment at school. And then I will talk to you a little bit briefly about how to set up a private evaluation if you choose to go that direction. So this is a general timeline, and this comes from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This is required by law. So if they go outside of this scope, then once again, you can file a complaint with a couple of different organizations. So the first thing you'll do is request an evaluation. So a parent, a teacher, or a school staff member can submit a written request for an evaluation to determine special education services. Written request are the keywords here. So do it in writing, send a letter, find out who you need to send that to. You can ask your student's teacher. If they don't know, go to the principal or a special education department within your school. Ask them who to write the letter to. My recommendation is to copy everyone on this list. Copy the teacher, copy the special education, copy the principal. The more people that receive this, the more evidence you have that it was requested. So you can also just Google, how do I request an evaluation for special education services? And they will give you some templates that you can use. But you want to give them, this is kind of a legal process, so you want to give them evidence as to why you're requesting this evaluation. The school has the responsibility to provide written notice to the parents, informing them of the evaluation request. So once the school has decided, if it's a teacher or a school staff member that has requested an evaluation be done on a student, they must get written permission. They must give written notice and get permission from the parents to provide this evaluation. Once there's a request made, according to the law, within 15 days, the school must respond to your request or the school's request from the teacher, etc. So they may either agree to evaluate the child or provide written notice explaining why they refuse to conduct the evaluation. If they agree, they must provide the parents with informed consent paperwork explaining the process, and you must sign that and return that. The timeline for returning that is as soon as possible, because the time frame between the parent's signature consenting and the evaluation doesn't start until the parent consents. So make sure that when you get that, you sign that as quickly as possible. If they don't agree to do an evaluation, again, there's a process. It's a legal process. It's a due process, filing for a due process. It's a complaint, basically, and you have to give compelling evidence as to why you believe your child needs that evaluation. Once that is signed, according to IDEA, within 60 days, this is the federal timeline, the school must complete the evaluation after the signed consent. So this timeline may vary slightly depending on state's regulations. In Utah, that regulation is 45 days, so it's less than the federal. States have the option to changing some of the timelines within the IDEA or some of the recommendations. It can never be more than what the federal timelines give as far as the evaluations. It can be less. Also with accommodations, the state can require more than the federal, but it cannot provide less. So state does have a little bit of control about those timelines, but they can never provide less service or timeframes than the federal timeline. Once the evaluation is done, you will have an eligibility determination meeting. So within a reasonable time, within a few weeks, once the evaluation is complete, then you will have a meeting with the school staff that are relevant and the parents, and then you will discuss the results and determine if the child qualifies for services under IDEA. Once again, if they say that your child does not qualify for services, you can file for due process or contact different organizations. We will discuss all of this in another webinar because it is a little more detailed, but there are processes you can go through to get that evaluation or to get the services if you don't agree with the school's decision. Then they will develop an individual education program, also called an IEP, within 30 days of the eligibility determination. These timelines are really important for parents to know because I've seen things drawn out way past these dates. So it's important to understand what these timelines are so that you can push the school to get these done in their legally required time frame. So this is when the IEP will be developed to tailor to the child's needs. We need to go into another detailed webinar about how that works because there are a lot of nuances within the law about IEPs and the development of those that parents don't know. They trust the school to know, they trust the school to do. Often some of the legal parts of the IEPs are missed. So it's important to understand what your child is entitled to under the law. And one thing that's really important to know, a parent's involvement in this whole process is not only suggested, it is required. The parent's input, the parent's observations, the parent has to be involved in this process. So if anything is ever done without a parent present or without parental consent, it is against the law. And then the IEP must be reviewed annually. So every year they must review the IEP. Testing doesn't need to happen less than every 3 years. But if parents and the school agree that a reevaluation is necessary prior to the 3 years, you can request that, and then that will have to be discussed. Now, one thing to note with this is even though an IEP is required to be handled annually, a parent can call an IEP meeting anytime they choose. You can also have, as a parent, people in the room with you in the IEP meeting that you choose. Generally, this will be someone who knows about IEPs or knows about your student specifically, your child specifically, can help make informed decisions about their IEP. So you can have additional people in the room with you. In fact, I recommend it because often if you go in as one parent or two parents, there will be a team, an IEP team in the room, and it can feel a little intimidating. Their plan is to help your student. That's what I will say. But sometimes having someone that knows the process makes you feel a lot more comfortable with the outcome of that. So those are some of the components of a school versus a private evaluation and what the school evaluation will do. Another thing to note with a private evaluation, the school is not required to take the results of that private evaluation. Most schools will, some might give you a little bit of a battle, and they might want to do their own evaluation. That's something we can discuss further, because you don't want to evaluate a child using the same test measurements within a year, because there is a test retest kind of thing that says if a child is tested more frequently than 1 year, if they remember the testing that was done just a few months ago, it can skew the results. So you can sort of fight to have at least those test scores used, rather than doing those tests again at school. But the school is not required to use a private evaluation, but you can push for that if necessary. You have any questions for me, Philip?
Absolutely. There's so much to cover, and obviously we want to try to keep this short. It's just an introduction. So we will get more in depth, but I'm fascinated by the point that you made, that I'm fascinated with this, how this interconnects with human rights. We all have a right to education. That's one of the rights that we have as citizens of the United States, given to the government with this federal education system. And because of that system now, they have a duty and a responsibility to educate every child in America, regardless of whether that child has a disability, a learning disability, a physical disability. Like, the government has taken on the responsibility, and we have tasked them with that, to educate every child. And so I think parents often want to stand up and fight for their kid, and it can feel confrontational. So I appreciate that you again talked about, let's do this in a manner that doesn't make you enemies with your local teachers or principal. Let's stay friends, but let's make sure that these parents know the law, because when the parents know the law, all you have to do is say, okay, well, if you don't do that, I'll be filing this, what did you call it?
Due process, file for due process
I
hearing.
will be filing a due process report then, and you'll be hearing more from the legal side. And they don't want that. And, the nice thing is, like you mentioned, we all want to provide an education for these children. We all have these kids' best interest at heart. But I wonder, we're looking at a school system, a public school system that was built for the masses. Implicit in that is that it will never answer all of the needs and the problems and the questions of every individual child, right?
Right.
And so, is there a disincentive for teachers and administrators to give all the kids who need IEPs and 504s IEPs and 504s, meaning that they might want to in their heart, but is it logistically impossible to do in a public school setting that was built up to educate the masses, not all of the individuals?
Yes, part of it is they don't have the staff, and they don't have the resources to do it. That is not, under the law, that is not a reason to not do it. It's also not a reason to give the child an individualized education program. It's against the law, so they must provide the resources.
Right.
If parents don't understand that, then they may accept that their child's not going to get services. Now, here's the other part of that that's difficult. There are certain requirements that must be met for a child to receive services. So one of those requirements is that it must be impacting their ability to learn in the classroom. So you might have a student that is a really bright student, and most of our dyslexic students are, and their dyslexia might be moderate. Let's say it's not severe, it might be moderate. So the parent knows that it's impacting their education because they have the potential of succeeding and exceeding much more than they are. But if you have a really kind of a high IQ kid and a kid that's doing well in math, and they're doing well enough in reading, even though their reading scores are much less than maybe their math scores or other scores, they're still within the range of what's normal for their grade. And so they're going to fall through the cracks, because the school is going to say, but this is not impacting their education because they're right kind of in there in that average place. They might be scoring in the mid 80s, which if everything else is scoring in the 100 or over 100, mid 80s is still an entire standard deviation, and we can talk about those terms later, below average. And so these kids are not living up to their potential and need the services, but according to the school criteria, they don't, they're not eligible for that. So that's the other part of why they may not get the services that they need. And that's a tough one because these kids will, and I've heard them called the shady 80s kids. They'll just kind of get through school getting B's, maybe C's, but they're still, going through school. The problem is they're not reaching their potential. And so
Yeah.
that's where the gray area comes in. And that's where parents often end up doing, getting a private tutor, somebody outside of that to increase those skills when the school criteria and the law criteria isn't met. And again, there is so much to discuss as far as the law, because it used to be that the school was only required to have minimal advancement with special education students. And now they have to have more rigorous standards, but most of the schools will still hold to that. So yes, that is a problem because a lot of students fall through the cracks, and that's when they end up going into private tutoring. Money is always an issue. The government is supposed to supply X amount of money for these kids under IDEA to get services. In reality, they don't. So schools are tied financially. So there are a lot of factors that go into that, unfortunately.
Well, and you mentioned going off of the averages, and if we're measuring by the averages instead of based off of what we know our child is capable of, then that's really frustrating for me as a parent because
Yes.
I want my child to progress based on his capability, not the average of all the other kids in the school. And to that point, you said the 80s. We're not talking, when you say 80s, I'm thinking, okay, 100% on the quiz, and 80s is like B level grades. That seems pretty good. That seems above average. You're using a different scale when you say 80s, right?
Yes. So anytime you do tests, you have a middle number. So this would be, for example, when you do any kind of standardized testing, all this testing is age normed. So it will be compared to students of their age, not grade, but age. So the average score would be 100 for the students of that age, or the individuals of that age, even adults. A standard deviation from that 100 is 15 generally. So it'd be 85 to 115 would be considered average. Now, if you're 85, 86, 87, you're considered low average, but you're still average. If you're in, the 110, 112, 113, 114, you're considered high average, but you're still within the average range. Once you hit to 85, then there are percentages within that. So the 100 would be, basically 100% kind of thing. But once you get down to, it's a bell curve. If you look at it as a bell curve, those percentages change substantially once you hit one standard deviation. Once you hit two standard deviations, the percentage is very low. So at 85, at a standard deviation of 15 at 85, your percentage is now dropped significantly, so that is a significant number. Once you are two standard deviations below, so let's say 70 below the 100, then it's considered impaired. So someone on an IQ test that scores 70 or below is considered intellectually delayed. That's how significant that is. So 70 may look like a C, because I think 70s are a C, 80 is a B. It's not the same thing, because once you hit 70 in these standard deviations and these scores, then you are considered impaired. So between 70 and 85, you're below average. But once you hit 70 or below, it's significantly impaired. So generally speaking, those are the kids that are going to get the services, kind of the ones that fall below that 85. The ones that are 85 may not, but they're still significantly lower than 100. So that's where they kind of fall through the cracks in some of those. Dyslexia comes on a spectrum, mild to profound, and the scores will kind of determine that. You can never use one test, by the way, to diagnose dyslexia. You can't just use an IQ test. You've got to use lots of measures, even within the school. They're required when they do assessments to use multiple measures in order to provide services.
Okay. How do you know all this stuff? You seem pretty smart and pretty well
Lots of
educated when it comes to assessments and tests.
So a couple of ways. First of all, when I started teaching kids with dyslexia and adults to read, I dove into every research, literacy, books, science of reading, all kinds of things. For years, I've been researching it. You don't get much education in higher education for this. I also have worked for a neuropsychologist for a number of years, and I have actually conducted the assessments. So I know assessments intimately. I also know the scores and the standard deviations and how those fall in. I know the components that go into diagnosing dyslexia, even though I personally can't diagnose. I can look at test scores and say, yes, it appears that the student may have dyslexia. I can look at those. I'm also currently in my graduate studies in curriculum and instruction, and have taken special education law courses through that, and also independently. And in developing curriculum for Operation Read, I've done a lot of research on what the curriculum needs to look like, what is the most effective curriculum, what we know about how to teach students to read. So lots of years of study and research and in school now.
So you like to geek out on this stuff.
I go on vacation and I think I should read some, fictional novel, and I always gravitate back towards my Kindle has more books on reading instruction and dyslexia and the science of reading than it has anything else. So yes, I geek out on it.
Fascinating discussion. So much more we can talk about and will talk about, including getting more into the legal rights. How do you file the due process report or request? How do you file or contact? Who do you contact? How do you contact the civil rights organizations that are fighting for your rights, your child's rights? Sometimes it takes a couple of extra steps. And then what do you do if ultimately the school comes back and says, no, we're not going to reassess, and no, they're within that, that one standard deviation, they're within the norm or the average. Then what do you do? We talked about that a little bit, but we'll dive into all of that again next time. Thank
Just
you.
one more note before we close, if I can do that. When I talk to parents about this and requesting evaluations and not agreeing with the school, yes, my first line of defense is always cooperate with them, be kind, try to work this out with the school before you go further. But sometimes you have to be that parent. And it's hard. It's difficult to be that parent. But sometimes the only way your student is going to get what they need is to be that parent. What I know is educators don't want your children to fail. They don't want them to fail. They're there to make your students succeed. Sometimes they just don't know what they don't know. And you as a parent are the one that gets to make that step forward, to educate them, teach them, let them know about your student and get what your student needs. And sometimes it takes being a little bit forceful, a little bit more than assertive to get those needs. And that's okay. And we can talk you through that process.
Yes, let the mama bear come out. Don't be afraid of that. I will say, I have talked to educators, I have talked to teachers, I have talked to administrators who didn't know all of these things. They didn't know the IEP and the 504 laws and all of the, now how many of them do, how many of them don't, I don't know. But I know that there are a lot out there who aren't equipped, who aren't knowledgeable about this whole process. And so you really do, you have to step up, you have to stand up, you have to fight for your kid and your child's education. So
Yes.
go fight, win. You've got this.